to another edition of Humble Theology. My name's John, and in this lesson we're doing Leviticus chapters 8 and 9. I'm actually doing it for a second time. I recorded this once, and I don't know what happened, but it's gone. So let's redo this. Anyway, you won't know the difference, but it's just funny to me. Technology, gotta love it. So anyway, if you haven't done so, probably pause the video here, read chapters 8 and 9 of Leviticus, and then come right back in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so key features, key points. Well, this is the prescribed worship that God is giving Moses. If you read the first 7 chapters, you have these offerings, the burnt offering, sin offering, all these things are being laid out in detail as to how they are to be followed. This is God's worship. We would say the same today. How is the New Testament telling us, prescribing for us what the worship of God is to look like? Are we just allowed to say and do whatever we want? And it's like, no. There's a stricter judgment, we're told, for teachers. We are to get the gospel right. We can't just worship however we want. There's a prescription by God on what to do and what it's to look like. Well, same here in the Old Testament. The gospel, what the Redeemer is going to accomplish, what his work is in atonement, all this is being expounded and laid out for the people. Originally, we could say we have the gospel in Genesis 3:15, that a redeemer will come and he'll crush the head and work of Satan, getting wounded in the process. That was enough for people to follow and say, we're waiting on God to do this. Well, now here, as we're moving from following individuals who were covenantally waiting on that promise to be fulfilled, now we're moving from individuals to a people group that is going to be following within that same footsteps, same principle, same covenant, waiting for the Redeemer. Which is why here in Leviticus we have laid out for us the rules and everything dealing with the spiritual life of people. Why is all of a sudden the Levitical law interested in your sin, in atonement, in being thankful to God, and all these types of things? Because that's your spiritual condition before Him. And God told Moses, and Moses had the discussion with God, unless you go with us, there's no point in going. But God's like, I can't go with you. If I go with you, you're stiff-necked people. I'll have to consume you. So, well, how does that work? God can live amongst and within His people by making atonement for them. And so this is now the spiritual essence of what the Redeemer's work is going to do. Again, we're told in the New Testament, it's not a surprise or shocker for us if we've read the whole book, that once you've gotten to the end and you look back and go, oh, that makes sense, that these things were for an example, for a teaching and training in us. Up to this point, we followed individuals, relying and resting on the promises of God to be with them, to live with them, to deliver them. Your Moses, your Abraham, your Noah, Isaac, Jacob, and so forth, and their faith and their stumblings. Well, now we're going to do the same thing, but through a people group. How does this look if a whole group of people are doing this, not just individually? So it's widening the scope. And in widening the scope, as Paul says in Romans, to them is entrusted the oracles and the ordinances of God, the things that point to His work, what to have faith in Him to do, what to believe His Redeemer is going to accomplish. All these things are being laid out for us here. So, in this, we see the discipline and instruction is needed. And in doing so, Moses is given these things by God. And yet, because Moses isn't going to live forever, well, we see the transition of authority in chapters 8 and 9. So everything laid out in chapters 1 through 7 describe the rituals, the ceremonies, these different offerings. And now here in chapter 8, we have Moses is going to enact them. So you have it in writing, the policy, you might say. You have someone who's going to show you how it's done. Moses is going to do this for Aaron and his sons. And then in chapter 9, Aaron and his sons take over. So kind of a transition of authority, God to Moses to Aaron. These things being basically communicated before the people. This doesn't happen in a closet somewhere. The congregation is called to be present at the tent of meeting. They're witnessing this. And so we relate to that. A priesthood called by God and yet ordained by those already in the ministry, as witnessed by and testified by those already in the ministry. There's usually a service of ordination when someone becomes a minister, elder, a deacon. And then that's done before the people. It's not done. It's like, well, yeah, hey, everybody, you go into church one day, and this is your new elder, Bob Smith, and over here is your new deacon, John Johnson, or whatever. It's no. Who are those guys? Where'd they come from? It's like, no, you know them in advance. They come up from within the people, and they're appointed based on the qualifications on what that was to be. And the qualifications are solid. We like to think they're a lot more loosey-goosey in our day and age, but like back in the Old Testament here, they had to be from Aaron's family. They had to be a Levite to be a priest. There's no questions about, well, but what if someone from a different family had just as much scriptural knowledge and was just as charismatic as Aaron? Sorry, that didn't matter. You could not be a priest. That was not going to be your role. That was not going to be what you were to do, no matter what you thought your skill set was at it. Same thing today. It's not a family lineage anymore, but we have various qualifications laid out in the New Testament. And if you don't meet those qualifications, the ministerial roles and ordinances of officers, deacons, elder, that's not for you. If you don't meet those qualifications, well, but this person is so good at whatever and so charismatic, they just got out of prison. Well, I'm sorry, there's a characteristic of reputation involved here. You're representing God Almighty, and so there are limits to these roles. And again, it's carried out before the people. In our modern day and age, we carry out the same type of biblical equity principle. The congregation usually has a say or a vote on the different ministers coming in. So that's the principles we see being established here. Moses, who was appointed by God, given these instructions, is now transferring them to Aaron and to what will be the continuation of the priesthood for ages to come. Again, same type of thing, just another illustration of this. Paul, as he's an apostle appointed by God in the New Testament, he himself goes and seeks to have his hands laid on by the apostles to confirm. He's not just going to do this willy-nilly on his own, but he presents himself to the other believers, makes sure they're in harmony with what's been going on in his life, and then they send him out on his different missionary journeys. And as he goes about and establishes churches, he then, continuing in his authority, passes on to ordain officers in the churches as he goes. See Acts 14:23. They're establishing and appointing officers in the churches that they're leaving behind as they travel. Let's see. I already mentioned that. The tabernacle is also, we see chapter 8, verse 10, the building, tent, the tabernacle in the Old Testament was anointed by Moses along with Aaron for its use. Well, we do the same thing today. You have a church building, and the big fuss is made. The church is the people, it's not the building. Yes, we all get that. I think everybody understands. But the building itself is usually consecrated, prayed over in some way, shape, or form, dedicated in some way, shape, or form to the use of God's people, to the use of discipling believers, to the use of the spreading and proclamation of the gospel. It's a building set aside from normal everyday use to use that facilitates what God is trying to accomplish in the world, making disciples. So we see the same thing, Moses and the dedication of the temple. That's why we can look at the Old Testament, or should be able to look at the Old Testament and say, see, these things are examples. They're micro pictures of the same things we're doing today. But not only is the building dedicated, but these ministers, the priesthood, Aaron and his sons, it says there towards the end of chapter 8 that they're doing this, and they're going to stay 7 days at the tent of meeting, well, so they don't die. Let's read that real quick here. So in chapter 8, scrolling. Verse 35 of chapter 8, remain for 7 days and nights, performing what the Lord has charged, so that you do not die. Okay, the seriousness of that office. Your life is involved. Your life is at stake in being represented or representing God in that office. It's very serious. I mean, today's day and age, people become ministers for various reasons. I hope just not as a career choice, but they really and truly honestly feel led by God. But I know for a fact there are plenty of people in the ministry who do not belong there. They do not meet the qualifications, and I believe their very life is on the line because God takes his worship very seriously. And as mentioned before from James, God holds his teachers, people proclaiming God's word, in much higher sense, a stricter sense, I believe is the language there, James 3:1, of judgment. I don't know exactly what that means, but we'll at least see an example of it in chapter 10 when Aaron's sons decide, well, we think we have a grasp of this and we're going to try something on our own. We'll discuss that more fully then, but just know that that's coming, I guess. If you've read ahead, you should know. So those are all the elements we see here in chapter 8. Everything that was described up to this point in the sacrifices are now being used in chapter 8, but they're being used in a manner of what was prescribed is now being exemplified for them so that they can actually do it. Because in chapter 9, we see that the priesthood is now ordained into office, into existence, and they're now going to be performing these duties. They perform them. Aaron and Moses come out from the inner part of the tabernacle. They bless the people, and God ordains fire to come down and consume everything that's on the altar before the people. And the people, it says, they were fearfully amazed. They were shocked and fell on their face. Well, do you go to church and not expect God to show up? Or if he does show up, something really moved your heart in seeing God laid out before you, in the bread and wine, his body and blood shed for you. Something about that really hit you in his sacrifice. In baptism, his death and resurrection, something about that really meant something in the service. It's a lot more than just the minister wanting a pat on the back at the end of a good sermon there, Pastor. It's like, no, his life was in jeopardy the whole time. And what did you walk away from it? Because if you just went to church flippantly, well, again, we'll see an example of that in the Old Testament where God said, I don't really want your sacrifices and your burnt offerings. That's not why you're doing this. This was being done so that you would have this heartfelt, moving relationship with me. Whereas you grow in your sanctification, you're being moved to conform yourself more and more into the image of my Son, the image morally laid out for you in the law. And if you're just like, I just punched my time card, I showed up, I went, isn't that enough? No, it's not. You're not getting from worship, or you're not participating in by faith. But anyway, so that's the conclusion there, chapter 8, chapter 9. Greatly simplified, I guess you could say. Plenty of books on this that go into greater detail about the meaning of every little jot and tittle that's here in the scriptures. But I just wanted to kind of point it out at high level and look at how we covenantally compare that to their day and age, to our day and age, and some of these covenantal distinctions and the equity that we say biblically carries forward into the church, into our day and age, the church then and the church now, them looking forward, us looking back. So that's it. If you have questions, comments, thoughts on the matter, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Even if it's something coming up in Leviticus, then by the time I get to it, I'll have it at least in the comments, and I can work to address those things ahead of time. So thank you in advance for doing so. Like always, it's a channel. You can like, subscribe as you want to. It's up to you. God bless. Take care, and we'll see you next time. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.